Recently saw a video about a group of very strange animals, marine invertebrates commonly called sea slugs. Now, the name sea slug covers several different groups, but today I want to tell you about just a couple of those. One is nudibranchs, which sounds like it should be an OnlyFans page, but it's not. Although their name does come from the Latin word for naked and the ancient Greek word for gills. Nudibranchs are often noted for their bright colors and striking forms, and they're often given colorful nicknames to match, like clown, marigold, splendid, dancer, dragon, and sea rabbit, just to name a few. Because I can't possibly name them all, there's like 3,000 known species. The others are a superorder of sea slugs called Sacoglassans, sometimes called sap-sucking sea slugs for reasons I'll talk about later. But both groups have members with some amazing abilities that I want to share with you today. So get ready to have your mind blown just a little bit as we take a closer look at some truly strange and amazing animals, sea slugs. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So let's start out with the nudibranchs. Although there are a few species that inhabit brackish waters, most nudibranchs are restricted to salt water. And as you might expect with 3,000 species, they're widely distributed, living in all the seas of the world from the Arctic and Antarctic to the tropics and everything in between. They also inhabit a wide range of depths in the ocean, from the intertidal zone, where they can be found in tidal pools at low tide, to depths of over 2,300 feet, 700 meters. Although there is one nudibranch species that was discovered at a depth of nearly 8,200 feet, 2,500 meters. I guess one advantage to being a marine invertebrate is not worrying about the crushing depths of the ocean. Discovered in 2024, it's the only known nudibranch to live in the bathypelagic zone, which is the ocean depth that extends from 3,300 to 13,000 feet, 1,000 to 4,000 meters below the ocean's surface, also called the midnight zone because sunlight doesn't penetrate that deep. This species, named Bathydevius, is also one of the very few nudibranchs that are bioluminescent. The greatest diversity of nudibranchs, though, are found in the warm, shallow reefs. But whatever depth you find them at, they're bottom dwellers, or at least like 2,995 of them are. Bathydevius, the one that I just told you about, doesn't live on the bottom. Two other species look like glass fish and are open ocean hunters, like the sharks of the nudibranch world. Another species just kind of floats around, going wherever the current takes it. And finally, there's one species that floats upside down just below the surface of the water, feeding on, get this, Portuguese men-o'-war and other jellyfish, along with other things. But not only that, these nudibranchs store the venomous nematocysts of their prey, absorbing them into their digestive tract and passing them to their own skin. A process that's not well understood. But the end result is that it lets them produce their own painful and potentially dangerous stings when handled. Pretty badass for an invertebrate that maxes out at about 1.5 inches, 40 millimeters. But still, most nudibranchs are found on the bottom. And again, as you might expect with so many species, the body forms and sizes of nudibranchs vary greatly. Adults range in size from just under 1/4 inch, about 4 millimeters, to nearly 2 feet, 600 millimeters. But they're all bilaterally symmetrical, at least on the outside. Internally is another story. The male and female sexual organs are on the right side of the body, owing to the fact that, like all gastropods, during their larval stage they undergo a process called torsion, where the internal organs and shell rotate 180 degrees with respect to the head and foot. Nudibranchs then go through a partial detorsion, where everything rotates back the other way. Not all the way back, mind you, but some. The adult nudibranchs don't have shells because they shed it at the end of their larval stage. The eyes of nudibranchs are set into their body, and they're simple, they're tiny, and they don't really do much more than discern light and dark. Instead, they use tentacles on their heads to feel, taste, and smell their way around their environment. Also on their back, they have plume-like structures, which is how they breathe. These are external gills, hence the name nudibranchs, naked gills. Now, while they may have lost their shells, that doesn't mean they're defenseless. I already told you about the one species that collects the stinging cells of its prey for its own use. But nudibranchs also use a variety of chemical defenses to protect themselves. All nudibranchs are carnivorous, and sponge-eating nudibranchs concentrate the chemical defenses of these prey sponges in their bodies, making them distasteful to predators. Pretty much exactly how monarch butterfly caterpillars concentrate the toxins from milkweed in their bodies to make them taste bad. Other species can actually produce their own chemicals, regardless of their diet. Still others will release an acid from their skin when they're physically irritated or touched by another creature. So all those bright colors are thought to be aposematism, something I've talked about before, an advertisement to predators that nudibranchs are not something they really want to put in their mouths. Nudibranchs are hermaphroditic, so they have both male and female reproductive organs, but they can't fertilize themselves because that would just be weird, so they engage in mutual fertilization. Mating usually takes just a few minutes and involves a dance-like courtship, which of course they can't see, so I'm not entirely sure how that works. Nudibranchs typically deposit their eggs in gelatinous ribbon-like spirals. The number of eggs varies depending on the species, from as few as just 1 or 2 to as many as an estimated 25 million. And like adults, nudibranch eggs contain toxins from sea sponges as a way to deter predators. The lifespan of nudibranchs ranges from a few weeks to a year, again depending on the species. Now, one last thing before we leave nudibranchs. In 1884, British zoologist Robert Edmund Grant reported captive nudibranchs producing a sound that he described as like the clink of a steel wire on the side of the jar. But exactly how the sound was produced and why the sound was produced was a mystery. Grant suggested that maybe the sound somehow worked to deter predators, or was a way for individual nudibranchs to communicate with each other. But despite this early account, there's no modern scientific studies that have confirmed Grant's findings. Most research on nudibranch communication focuses on chemical cues, with no evidence of sound-based signaling. Grant's 1884 description remains the only quote-unquote documented case of nudibranchs producing audible sound, and it's still unclear whether this phenomenon is real and reproducible, or maybe just limited to specific species. Okay, now let's look at another group of sea slugs, the Sacoglassans. Sacoglassa species are found worldwide in tropical and temperate oceans, but most live in the central Pacific, where they frequent the shorelines of tropical islands. Unlike the carnivorous nudibranchs, Sacoglassans eat the cellular contents of algae, hence why, as I mentioned earlier, they're sometimes called sap-sucking sea slugs. By the way, that would make a great band name, just throwing it out there, sap-sucking sea slugs. Now, some Sacoglassans simply digest the fluid they suck from the algae, but in some species, like the jellyfish-eating nudibranchs, they sequester and use living chloroplasts from the algae they eat in their own tissue, a very unusual phenomenon known as kleptoplasy, which is usually found only in single-celled organisms. Sacoglassans tend to be small, maxing out at barely over an inch or 3 centimeters. They look kind of like winged slugs with a pair of tentacles on their head. In the kleptoplastic members of this group, the wings can be unfurled to maximize the surface area that's struck by sunlight, not unlike the leaf of a tree. They're typically uniform in color, shades of green, because of the chloroplasts they eat and install in their own cells. But at this point, you might be wondering what they use these chloroplasts for. I mean, they're not a plant, right? No, they're not. But like a plant, sacoglassans can maintain these cells for hours or even months and metabolize the photosynthetic products the cells produce. In fact, sacoglassans can, when necessary, survive for months living solely on the photosynthetic products of these acquired plastids. And this process is something of a mystery, since the upkeep of chloroplasts in plants usually requires interaction with genes encoded in the plant cell nucleus, which suggests that the plant cell genes have been laterally transferred from the algae to the sacoglassans. How cool is that? Another unclear step in this process is how the chloroplasts are protected from just getting digested, and how they adapt to their new position in animal cells without the membranes that would normally control their environment in the algae. Sacoglassans can also use compounds produced by their algal foodstuffs to deter their own would-be predators in a process termed kleptochemistry. These guys are just little kleptos. This might be achieved by converting algal metabolites to toxins, say that 10 times fast, algal metabolites, like the nudibranchs do with the sponges, or by using algal pigments for camouflage. But sacoglassans can also choose which method of feeding they use. Now, photosynthesis is not the preferred method, mind you. If food is readily available, they'll eat the food. But if food is scarce, they can switch from active feeding to photosynthesis. The length of these starvation periods, with photosynthesis and no active feeding, vary between species from less than a week to over 4 months. Basically, photosynthesis is used as a desperate last resort to avoid dying. But here's where it gets really amazing. In some species, individuals can decapitate themselves, a behavior called autotomy. This behavior has been studied in at least 2 species. In these studies, it was observed that the neck wound would usually close within a day, and the heads, especially in younger individuals, began to feed on algae within hours. 20 days later, they'd grown an entirely new body, but the discarded bodies didn't regrow new heads. Now, at first, it was thought that this might be a way to avoid predation, like those lizards that drop their tails, but the process is much too slow for that. The current hypothesis is that it happens when the animals are infected with parasites, so they just discard the parasite-ridden body and grow a new one. How the slugs survive without a heart and other vital organs for nearly a month remains a mystery, but it's assumed to be tied to this ability to use photosynthesis essentially as a life support system. And on that, well, we will stop while we're ahead. Get it? Stop while we're ahead? Oh, okay. Anyways, it's the end of the episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, here's how you can do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get free Dispatches from the Forest merch. Find all the details at patreon.com/dispatchesfromtheforest. Donate through either PayPal or Venmo using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, which is also how you can contact me if you have any questions, comments, or requests for future episodes. You can also donate using the Cash App and the hashtag #ForestNerd. You're welcome to send a check, just message me for my mailing address. And of course, there's Dispatches from the Forest merch for sale. Go check out the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest. Click on products and see everything that we have to offer. Finally, you can follow Dispatches from the Forest on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. Dispatches from the Forest recognizes that the lands where we live, work, and recreate are the traditional homelands of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho people. We understand that this land holds immense significance for the original stewards, native nations, and peoples of this region. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest and may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.